Welcome back to the Tech Loft Podcast, Ep.8. Make sure you're subscribed on Spotify and YouTube so you don't miss out on any of our tech explorations. Today, we're diving into the world of the NES. But not just any games. We're looking at the ones that seem to defy reality. The ones that made you wonder, how did they do that on the NES?
It's fascinating, isn't it? You'd think we'd know all its secrets by now, but the NES keeps surprising us.
Right, we're going beyond just saying, wow, good graphics for an 8-bit system, and actually understanding the techniques developers use to squeeze every ounce of power out of that little gray box.
Exactly. It all comes down to clever coding, understanding the hardware inside and out, and sometimes even exploiting its quirks to achieve things that nobody thought were possible.
Okay, so before we get to the specific games, can we talk about these memory mappers and enhancement chips I keep hearing about? What were those exactly?
Great question. Think of the NES console itself as a basic computer. It has a set amount of processing power and memory. Now, the game cartridges themselves could actually contain extra hardware. These memory mappers and enhancement chips, it's like plugging in a better graphics card or adding more RAM to your computer. These chips gave developers more freedom with graphics and allowed them to do things the NES alone just couldn't handle.
So it wasn't just the developers being amazing programmers. They had some secret weapons in the cartridges themselves.
Exactly. A great example of this is Batman: Return of the Joker from 1991. This game has these incredibly detailed, multi-layered backgrounds. Some people even thought it looked like a 16-bit game at the time.
I remember playing that game. The backgrounds were amazing, especially for the NES. But the NES only has one background layer, right? How did they create that illusion of depth?
That's the genius part. They weren't actually creating multiple layers. They were using the memory mapper to swap out background tile animations incredibly quickly. It's like a super fast flipbook. The graphics chip was essentially tricked into displaying a constantly changing background.
That's so clever. So they weren't really breaking the rules. They were just bending them in ways nobody thought of before.
Exactly. And if you were to play Batman: Return of the Joker on an emulator and disable the memory mapper, the illusion completely disappears. You're left with a static, much less impressive background.
Okay, so Batman is a great example of tricking the eye to create something that seems impossible.
Yeah.
Are there any games where developers literally did things the NES was not supposed to be able to do?
Oh, absolutely. One that comes to mind is G.I. Joe, also from 1991. There's this seemingly unremarkable elevator in level 3, but it's actually a technical marvel.
An elevator. Okay, I'm officially intrigued. How can an elevator be a technical marvel?
Because this elevator is overlaid on top of the background, the NES was designed to have sprites either in front of or behind the background, not directly on top of it. This was considered impossible.
So how on earth did they pull it off?
They used a combination of clever sprite work for the edges of the elevator and something called the MMC3 chips interrupt feature.
Okay, break that down for me. What's this interrupt feature all about?
Imagine the NES drawing the screen line by line like a printer. The interrupt feature is like setting an alarm clock during that process. When the alarm goes off, the NES is forced to stop drawing the background and run a specific piece of code. In this case, that code tells the NES to draw the elevator directly over whatever the background is supposed to be, on a very specific line of the screen.
So they basically hijacked the NES's normal drawing process to force it to do something it wasn't designed to do.
Precisely. And you'll notice there's a shadow underneath the elevator. It's likely there to hide any potential glitches that might happen because of this unusual technique.
It's amazing how deeply these developers understood the NES hardware. Okay, so we've seen fake depth in Batman and impossible overlays in G.I. Joe. What other technical wizardry awaits us in the world of NES?
Well, let's talk about a game called Crisis Force, which was also released in 1991. This game is famous for its incredibly smooth parallax scrolling, particularly in level 1.
Parallax scrolling, that thing where the background moves at a different speed than the foreground to create a sense of depth. I've seen that in other NES games, though. What makes Crisis Force special?
What makes Crisis Force special is that it uses vertical parallax scrolling, something that was not thought possible on 8-bit consoles. They could handle horizontal splits, different parts of the screen moving left and right at different speeds, but not vertical ones. That was a feature you usually only saw on more powerful 16-bit systems.
Wait, so if 8-bit consoles couldn't do vertical parallax scrolling, how did they make it work in Crisis Force?
It's likely they used a technique similar to Batman, rapidly swapping out graphics banks to simulate the effect. Remember, the NES can only display one background layer at a time, but if you change that layer fast enough, you can trick the eye into seeing a smoothly scrolling, multi-layered scene.
It's incredible how these developers worked around the NES's limitations. It just goes to show you that creativity can blossom even when you have constraints.
Absolutely. And there's one more game I think we need to talk about before we wrap up this part of our NES exploration. It's called Summer Carnival 92 Rekka, and it's often considered the ultimate NES graphical powerhouse.
Ultimate graphical powerhouse.
Yeah.
Okay, you've got my attention. What makes this game so special?
Well, first of all, it has amazing music, incredible sprite handling, the characters look fantastic, and a couple of visual effects that just shouldn't be possible on the NES.
You can't just say that and not tell me what the effects are. I need details.
Okay. First, there's a sine wave background ripple effect. It's not entirely unique, but the smoothness of the effect on the NES is remarkable.
Sounds cool. And the second effect.
The second one is truly mind-blowing. It's a scaling and warping effect that makes it look like the background is being stretched and squashed in real time. It's the kind of thing you'd expect to see on a Super NES, not an 8-bit NES.
Wait, the NES can't do scaling, can it? I thought that was way beyond its capabilities.
You're right, it shouldn't be able to. But somehow the developers of Rekka pulled it off. The most likely technique was manipulating both the horizontal and vertical scrolling with incredible precision, creating that squashing, stretching illusion through super fast background changes.
So they were basically pushing the NES beyond its intended limits once again.
Exactly. And here's the truly mysterious part. They probably used undocumented features of the NES graphics chip to achieve this. Nobody's 100% sure how they did it because they were operating at the absolute edge of what anyone thought was possible. It's like they hacked the NES on a hardware level.
That is incredible. These NES developers were true pioneers, finding ways to do things nobody thought possible.
Yeah.
It makes you think. What limitations are we underestimating today? What seemingly impossible things will be commonplace in the future?
Now, that's a question worth pondering. It really makes you appreciate the ingenuity and dedication of those early game developers.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
It wasn't just about pushing graphical limits either. Some games pushed the boundaries in other areas like sound design, processing power,
Yeah.
and memory.
You're right. One game that comes to mind is Castlevania III, Dracula's Curse from 1989. It had these branching paths and multiple playable characters, which added so much depth to the gameplay. And the music, it's still considered one of the best soundtracks on the NES.
Oh man, the music in Castlevania III was epic. I remember thinking it sounded way too good for the NES. Some versions even had an extra sound chip in the cartridge to make the music even richer.
That's right. Developers were always finding ways to squeeze more out of the system. Speaking of squeezing more out, we have to talk about Kirby's Adventure from 1993. This game came out towards the end of the NES's life, and it's incredible how much they packed into it.
I loved Kirby's Adventure. What made it so technically impressive?
Well, for one thing, it had this really cool scaling effect in one section that almost looked like Mode 7, which was a graphics mode on the Super NES that allowed for pseudo 3D effects. To get something like that on the NES was pretty mind-blowing.
Wow, I never realized that. It's amazing how they managed to mimic effects from a much more powerful system.
And on top of that, Kirby's Adventure was huge. It had so many different abilities, enemies, levels. It's actually the largest NES cartridge ever made. They really pushed the limits of cartridge technology with that one.
So they were pushing boundaries in terms of graphics, sound, and even cartridge size. It makes you wonder, was there anything they didn't try to push?
Yeah.
What about 3D? Were there any games that tried to create a true 3D experience on the NES?
There were a few attempts, although true 3D on the NES was a tall order. One of the most notable was 3D World Runner from 1987. It wasn't true 3D in the modern sense, but it did a great job of creating the illusion of running through a 3D space.
Oh yeah, I vaguely remember that one. It was like a futuristic running game, right?
Exactly. You controlled a character named Jack, and you ran through these scrolling environments, blasting enemies. The scaling effects as you moved were pretty impressive for the time. And they even bundled the game with 3D glasses.
3D glasses for the NES. Now that's a blast from the past. So while it wasn't true 3D, it sounds like 3D World Runner was still pretty ambitious for its time.
Definitely. It showed that developers were already thinking about 3D even in the early days of the NES. And speaking of pushing boundaries, we can't forget about character animation. Games like Prince of Persia, which was ported to the NES in 1990, had incredibly fluid and detailed animations for the time.
Prince of Persia was a classic. The way the prince moved, jumped, fought, it was so smooth and lifelike. You really felt like you were controlling a real person.
It was remarkable, especially considering the limitations of the NES hardware. It goes to show that you don't always need cutting-edge technology to create a compelling and immersive experience.
So true. And while we're on the topic of impressive animation, I have to mention Swordmaster from 1990. It had these huge, colorful sprites, detailed backgrounds, and smooth parallax scrolling. It was a visual feast for the NES.
Absolutely. Swordmaster is a perfect example of a game that might not have been a groundbreaking masterpiece in terms of gameplay, but it was visually stunning and pushed the limits of what the NES could do. And while we're on the topic of visually stunning NES games, we can't forget about Willow, which came out in 1989. This game had such detailed environments and large, well-drawn characters that you might even mistake it for a Super NES game at first glance.
Willow. I've heard of it, but I never got a chance to play it. What made the graphics so impressive?
Well, the level of detail in the environments was fantastic, and the character sprites were large and clean. They really pushed the limits of what the NES could display, and it shows in the final product.
Wow, I'll check that one out. It's amazing how these developers managed to squeeze so much detail out of a system that was seemingly so limited.
It really is a testament to their creativity and ingenuity. And speaking of pushing graphical limits, there's one more game that I think is worth mentioning. It's Batman: Return of the Joker, which we talked about earlier.
Return of the Joker. Did we already cover that one?
We did, but there's another aspect of its graphics that's worth highlighting. It used a special chip in the cartridge to enhance the visuals, particularly the size and fluidity of the sprites. It's one of the reasons the game looks so good and stands out from other NES titles.
So even with games we've already discussed, there is still more layers to uncover when it comes to how they pushed the limits of the NES.
Exactly. It's like peeling back the layers of an onion. There's always something new to discover, some new trick or technique that developers use to make these games so special.
I love that analogy. It's like a never-ending treasure hunt of NES secrets. You know, it's really inspiring to see how these developers were able to overcome technical limitations and create such groundbreaking games.
I think it's a testament to human ingenuity and the drive to create something truly special, even when faced with constraints.
And it makes you wonder what limitations we might be underestimating today. What seems impossible now might be commonplace in the future. Just like those NES developers found ways to do things no one thought possible on that hardware. Who knows what amazing things people will be doing with technology in the years to come.
That's a great point. The possibilities are endless. So to wrap things up, what are some of the key takeaways you'd like our listeners to remember from this episode about NES games that pushed hardware limits?
I think the biggest takeaway is that limitations can actually breed creativity. When you're forced to work within constraints, you have to think outside the box and come up with innovative solutions.
It's like that saying, necessity is the mother of invention.
Exactly. And I think these NES developers really embodied that spirit. They weren't afraid to experiment, to hack the hardware, to try things that no one had ever done before. And as a result, they created some truly unforgettable games that still hold up today.
And it's not just about the technical achievements. These games were fun to play. They had great gameplay, memorable characters, and engaging stories.
That's right. At the end of the day, a game is only as good as its ability to entertain. And these NES games managed to be both technically impressive and incredibly fun to play, which is a pretty amazing feat.
Well said. So for anyone listening who wants to experience these groundbreaking games for themselves, where should they start?
There are a lot of great resources online for finding and playing NES games. Emulators are a popular option, and there are also services like the Nintendo Switch Online NES Library that offer a curated selection of classic games.
And, of course, there's always the option of tracking down the original cartridges, though that can get a little pricey.
True. But there's something special about holding an original NES cartridge in your hands. It's a tangible piece of gaming history.
I totally agree. Well, I think that about covers it for this episode. Any final thoughts you'd like to leave our listeners with?
It's like these developers took the limitations of the NES as challenge, almost like a puzzle to solve.
Exactly. Instead of being limited by the hardware, they used it as a springboard for creativity.
And they weren't just making tech demos. These were full-fledged, fun, and engaging games. They took those technical achievements and used them to tell stories, create memorable characters, and build entire worlds.
It's a great reminder that technology is just a tool. It's up to the creators to use that tool in a way that's meaningful and entertaining.
Well said. So if someone listening wants to experience these games firsthand, where should they start?
Emulators are a great option. There are tons of them available online, and they allow you to play NES games on your computer or even your phone.
And for those who want a more authentic experience, there's always the option of tracking down the original cartridges and an NES console.
That's right, though. It can be a bit more challenging and expensive these days. But there's definitely a certain charm to playing those games the way they were originally intended.
Absolutely. There's nothing quite like holding that chunky controller in your hands and blowing on a cartridge to get it to work.
It brings back so many memories.
It really does. Well, I think that about wraps up our exploration of NES games that push the boundaries of what people thought was possible. It's been a fascinating journey.
I completely agree. It's amazing to see how much innovation and creativity came out of that era.
And it makes you wonder what the future holds. What limitations will developers overcome next? What seemingly impossible feats will they achieve?
Only time will tell, but one thing's for sure, as long as there are passionate and creative people out there, the world of technology will never cease to amaze us.
Well said. Thank you so much for joining me on this nostalgic trip back to the 8-bit era.
It was my pleasure.
And thank you for listening to the Tech Loft Podcast. Don't forget to subscribe on Spotify and YouTube so you don't miss out on our future tech explorations. For more tech discussions, visit us at thetechloft.com. Join us again for the next episode.